Okay, I think we can start. Welcome to the third day of the Language of Empowerment series. It's great to see all of you here today. Before we begin, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Tomasz Wicherkiewicz from the Faculty of Modern Languages and Literatures at our university. Professor Wicherkiewicz is the head of the Department of Language Policy and Minority Studies, as well as Deputy Director for Research at the Institute of Oriental Studies at the Faculty of Modern Languages and Literatures, AMU. He's a sociolinguist specializing in the field of minority languages, endangered languages and their documentation, as well as language policy and typology. He's the author of such books as Ethnic Minorities, Identity, Dilemmas, and Context, Policy of Multiculturalism, that was published in 2014. In 2016, he co-edited a book on integral strategies for language revitalization, and his newest publication from 2021 focuses on letters of freedom and captivity, scriptal planning and language ideologies in Baltic, Central, Eastern Europe. Professor Wicherkiewicz is a founder of the Polish Bureau for Regional and Minority Languages and works as an expert in the field of minority language policy for a number of Polish and European institutions. And last but not least, Professor Wicherkiewicz is also the member of the advisory board for to Bilingualist Matters at Poznań, which is affiliated with our faculty and which is very close to our hearts here. And today, Professor Wicherkiewicz will deliver a lecture titled Language Policies as Tools of Empowering Marginalized Language Communities. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great honor, dear neighbors. Well, I'd like to start with expressing my great gratitude for the invitation to this very important event and the opportunity to reflect together with you on a topic to which I have devoted most of my academic life. Let's start this talk. Let's start this talk with a frequently repeated, yet not trivial statement. It's now widely known that many languages in the world are currently in rapid decline. Of the estimated over 7,000 languages spoken in the world today, current trends show that between 20 and 50% will disappear or can disappear by the end of the 21st century. However, these figures show only one aspect of the loss of linguistic diversity, the quantitative one. As linguists, we are perfectly aware that beyond the spectacle of the extinction of scores of individual languages, an even more dramatic spectacle is played out behind the scenes, that of intensified qualitative changes that occur within the systems of hundreds of languages. However, and above all, from the most human perspective, the decline of the linguistic diversity of the world is the sum of the weakening linguistic well-being conditions of the minority communities that use them. The disappearance of languages, which we often seem to forget, is also the disappearance of the richness of contexts of natural human multilingualism. Language decline and language death always occur in bilingual or multilingual settings in which a majority dominant language, a language with greater political power, privilege, and social prestige, comes to replace the range and functions of a smaller minority language. The inevitable result of this process is that speakers of the minority language shift over time to speaking the majority language. While the distinction between majority and minority languages, as with majority and minority groups, tends to draw attention to numerical size, its most important reference is to differences in power, rights, and privileges. That said, The distinction between majority and minority languages needs to be treated with some caution, since the dichotomy inevitably understates the complex situatedness of particular language varieties with respect to power relations. Let's talk about the process of language shift. A very simplified scheme of language shift usually involves three quite broad and diversified stages. The first one, which sees increasing pressure on minority language speakers to speak the majority language, particularly in formal language domains. This stage is often precipitated and facilitated by the introduction of education in the dominating language. It leads to the eventual decrease in the functions of the minority language, with the public or official functions of that language being the first to be replaced by the majority language. The second stage sees a period of unstable bilingualism or diglossia, in which both languages continue to be spoken concurrently. However, this stage is usually characterized by a decreasing number of minority language speakers, especially among the younger generations, along with a decrease in the fluency of speakers as the minority language is spoken less and employed in fewer and fewer language domains. The third and often final stage, which may occur during 2 or 3 generations, sometimes less, sees the replacement of the minority language with the majority one. The minority language may be still remembered by a residual group of language speakers, but it's no longer spoken as a wider language of communication. Of course, throughout the course of human history, such language loss and language shifts have always occurred. Languages have risen and fallen, become obsolete, died, or adapted to changing circumstances in order to survive. But what is qualitatively and quantitatively different in our century is the unprecedented scale of this process of decline and loss. Some analysts have even described it as a form of linguistic genocide. And such claims are also supported by some hard data. For example, a survey by Summer Institute of Linguistics, published in 1999, found that there were 51 languages with only one speaker left, some 500 with fewer than 100 speakers, some 1,500 languages with less than 1,000 speakers, and more than 3,000 languages with less than 10,000 speakers. It concluded even more clearly that 96 of the world's languages were spoken by only 4% of its people. These figures graphically reinforce an earlier suggestion made by Michael Krauss that in addition to the 50% of languages that can die within the course of this century, another 40% of languages are threatened or endangered. Given the processes of language shift and decline outlined before, and the current unsafe state of many minority languages, it's not hard to see why. Even majority languages are no longer immune to such processes, not least because of the rise of English as a global language. But let's go back to the same survey published in the year 2000, and this year by the Ethnologue, which finds that there were over 150 languages with less than 10 first language speakers. Again, some almost 500 with less than 100 speakers, and over 1,500 living languages with less than 1,000 users, which shows quite tautologically that the languages of the smallest communities are the least safe. Perhaps at this point, it's worth citing a warning that Michael Krauss, a recently deceased researcher of the disappearing languages of Alaska, issued to linguists and linguistics themselves. In the photo, Michael sits next to the very last user of the Ayak language. He researched and started to revitalize. In 1992, he warned, indeed, we must do some serious rethinking of our priorities, lest linguistics go down in history as the only science that presided obliviously over the disappearance of 90% of the very field to which it is dedicated. Given the projected scale of language loss, comparisons are increasingly made between endangered languages and endangered animal and plant species. As Steven Pinker observes, the wide-scale extinction of languages currently underway is reminiscent of the current, though less severe, wide-scale extinction of plant and animal species. Similarly, James Crawford argues that each falls victim to predators, changing environments, or more successful competitors. Each is encroached on by modern cultures aided by new technologies, and each is threatened by destruction of land and livelihoods, the spread of consumerism and other Western values. On the contrary, some commentators have observed that when biodiversity is high, so is cultural and linguistic diversity. The use of biological evolutionary metaphors to describe the plight of many of today's minority languages seems appropriate. Not least because such metaphors highlight the scale and severity of the possible loss of such languages in the world. But biological metaphors also reinforce a widely held view that language loss is an inevitable part of the cycle of social and linguistic evolution. Thus, one could view the loss or death of a language as simply a failure on its part or its speakers to compete adequately in the modern world where, of course, only the fittest languages can and should survive. This form of linguistic social Darwinism is widely articulated by majority language speakers, conveniently secure in their own linguistic and cultural heritage, but is by no means limited to them. Many minority and minoritized language speakers see their social, cultural, and economic advancement or evolution in the guise of a majority language. But in another more important sense, biological metaphors obscure the wider social and political factors at work in language loss. Language loss is not only, perhaps not even primarily, a linguistic issue. It has much more to do with power, prejudice, unequal competition, and in many cases, overt discrimination and subordination, as stated even by Noam Chomsky, who is not particularly famous for his concern about minority languages. Questions of language are basically questions of power. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that the vast majority of threatened languages are spoken by socially and politically marginalized and or subordinated minority groups. These groups have been variously estimated at between 5,000 and 8,000 and include within them almost 500 million members of indigenous peoples in the world, perhaps the most marginalized of all people groups. They make up less than 5% of the world's population, but account for over 15% of the poorest. Language death seldom occurs in communities of wealth and privilege, but rather to the dispossessed and disempowered. Moreover, linguistic dislocation for a particular community of speakers seldom, if ever, occurs in isolation from socio-cultural and socio-economic dislocation as well. The loss of a minority language is almost always part of a larger process of social, cultural, and political displacement. Situating languages, language endangerment, and loss within the wider context of social and political power leads to further recognition that biological metaphors ignore the fact that languages are historical, social, and political constructs. If languages and their status are the product of wider political, social, or historical forces, we can discount the process of natural selection that a biological account would seem to imply. There's nothing natural about the status and prestige attributed to particular majority languages. And conversely, the stigma that is often attached to minority languages or dialects or varieties. In fact, the stigmatization process of minority languages often involves their equation with, or more accurately, relegation to dialects, gvaras, patois, topolects, or other less languagely languages. Even the term language itself indicates this construction process, since, for example, what actually constitutes a language as opposed to, for example, a dialect, remains controversial. Certainly, we cannot always distinguish easily between a language and a dialect on linguistic grounds, since some languages are mutually intelligible, some dialects of the same language are not. The example here might be Norwegian, since it was regarded as a dialect of Danish until the beginning of the 19th century, or Afrikaans, considered a Dutch dialect until the early 20th century. But in the former case, it was only with Norwegian independence from Sweden at the beginning of the 20th century that Norwegian acquired the status of a separate language, albeit one that has since remained mutually intelligible with both Swedish and Danish. Modern examples of this process can be seen in the former Yugoslavia, with the emergence in the 90s of distinct Croatian and Serbian in place of a previously common Serbo-Croat language, followed by the latter distinction of Bosnian and Montenegrin. What these examples clearly demonstrate is that languages are created out of the politics of state-making, not, as we often assume, the other way around. Independence for Norway, the breakup of Yugoslavia have precipitated linguistic change, creating separate languages where previously there was only one. The central role of the nation state, especially in Europe's political tradition, in determining what a language is and what is not, could also help explain the scale of projected language loss. One only has to look at the number of nation states in the world today, at approximately 200, and perhaps 300 or so languages that are projected to survive the long term to make the connection. That many of these languages are already recognized as national or regional languages or are currently spoken by groups who wish them to become so, serves only to strengthen this connection further. Such is the narrow concentration of officially recognized languages that around 120 nation states have actually adopted English, French, Spanish, or Arabic as their official language, while another 50 have a local language as the state language. Additionally, there are a few dozen languages that are awarded some regional status worldwide. In short, currently less than 1.5% of the languages are recognized officially by nation states. Why then are nation states and the ideology of nationalism that underpins them so central to the question of minority language loss? The first and obvious response to this question is that we live in the era of the nation state. The nation state remains the core of the political world order, exercising internal political and legal jurisdiction over its citizens, and claiming external rights to sovereignty and self-government in the present world political system. The triumph of universalism with respect to language is evidenced by the replacement over time of a large number of language varieties spoken within the borders of a nation state with one common national language. Sometimes, albeit rarely, a number of national languages. This process usually involves the legitimation and institutionalization of the chosen national language. The chosen national language becomes associated with modernity and progress, while the remaining minority languages become associated with obsolescence and, still not so bad, tradition. The requirement of speaking a common language is unique to nation states and a relatively recent historical phenomenon. It's unique because previous forms of political organization did not require this degree of linguistic uniformity. For example, for the most part, empires left unmolested the plethora of cultures and languages subsumed within them. As long as taxes were paid, all was well. The Greek, the Roman empires are obvious examples in Europe, while the examples from the New World include the Aztec and Inca empires in the Americas. More recent historical examples include the overtly multilingual policy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But perhaps the clearest example is that of the Ottoman Empire, which actually established a formal system of millets, ethnies, in order to accommodate the cultural and linguistic diversity of peoples within its borders. The inevitable consequence of establishing an ethnically exclusive and culturally and linguistically homogeneous nation state is a realm from which minority languages and cultures are effectively banished. In fact, this is the ideal, in inverted commas, ideal model to which most nation states and nationalist movements still aspire. Although in the face of a much more complex and contested multi-ethnic and multilingual reality. As Nancy Dorian summarized it, it is the concept of the nation state coupled with the official standard language that has in modern times posed the greatest threat to both the identities and the languages of small communities. Florian Kulmas observes even more succinctly that the nation state that has evolved since the French Revolution is the natural enemy of minorities. This brings us again to the interrelationships between the nation state and language loss. Despite the nation state's current ascendancy and its related normalization and value, it has in recent years come under increasing pressure of language policies, both from above and below. From above, the inexorable rise of globalization, along with the burgeoning influence of multinational corporations and supranational political organizations, required modern nation states to re-evaluate the limits of their own political and economic sovereignty. From below, minority groups are increasingly exerting the rights either to form their own nation states, as seen in various secessionist and irredentist movements around the world, or for greater representation within existing nation-state structures. It is this last development and its implications for the social, cultural, and political organization of nation-states that are most pertinent to the issue of minority language loss and displacement. In effect, minority groups are increasingly beginning to question and contest the principles and effects of nation-state congruence, nation-state orchestrated language policies, not least because of the long historical proscription of minority languages and cultures that have usually attended it. In the process, national identity, its parameters, and its constituent elements have been open to debate, particularly with respect to questions of bilingualism, and to varying extent multiculturalism. The significance of the nation state and political nationalism raises another important question. Given the historical predominance of the nation state over the last 2 centuries, can indeed should anything be done to change the positioning of minority languages in relation to it? After all, it's one thing to highlight the power relations underlying the selective national recognition of languages. It's another to try to turn the tide of minority language loss which is its consequence. A response to the latter can be found in the field of linguistic human rights, emerging since the 1990s. Advocates of linguistic human rights highlight effectively and well the wider political and social processes that underlie the loss of minority languages. In response, they argue that minority languages and their speakers should receive at least some of the protection and institutional support that majority languages already enjoy. These arguments are also echoed in much of the academic legal discourse that has developed in recent years with respect to minority group rights. The advocates of linguistic human rights tend to assume that identity of linguistic minority groups as given, the collective aims of linguistic minority groups as uniform, and the notion of collective rights as unproblematic. Thus, Tomasz Kutnakangas and Richard Phillipson have argued that the notion of linguistic human rights is reflected at the level of linguistic communities by the collective rights of peoples to maintain their ethno-linguistic identity and difference from the dominant society and its language. The common disjuncture between the individual and collective objectives immediately problematizes the legitimacy of any claim to a minority language right, regardless of its social and political merits. As already stated, language have never disappeared at the current pace, and yet their preservation, support, or empowerment has been so difficult, despite all technological and economic or scientific resources available to us, to humanity, and despite the awareness of this process. Although the term language revitalization is most often used to cover a wide range of situations of speech communities, as well as varying degrees and constellations of language endangerment, scholars and activists have developed many different concepts and approaches to deal with the problem of language loss. Language maintenance can be an essential aim for communities still using their language, but exposed to pressures associated with the dominant language or languages, and factors resulting in increased language endangerment, such as discrimination, school education only in the dominant language, economic pressures, and difficulties. Many are therefore undergoing gradual shrinkage in the number of domains in which the languages are used. Language revitalization is often referred to as a possible scenario of action in communities undergoing a language shift, where the youngest community members do not use or learn the language. Yet another term, language reclamation, is sometimes used regarding the efforts of a community to regain a language that was lost due to external factors, whereas language revival refers to a scenario where a community tries to bring back and start using a language that already ceased to be spoken. Language renewal is defined as a potential kind of revitalization of a language that experiences severe decay when it's spoken only by imperfect learners and is revived from the state rather than its previous original form. Commonly used are the terms language revitalization and preservation, depending on the status of an endangered language and the extent of activities to make its survival and continuity possible. Employing language merely as a symbol of distinctiveness of a group, along with a focus on language for performance, can lead to commodification of ethnic culture, but not to language revitalization. The cultural context of language revitalization should not be reduced to single components, as important as they are, such as dances, songs, costumes, or traditional cuisine. Rather, language and culture, with their worldview, norms, classification systems, as well as mechanisms of reenactment, reproduction, regulation, and transformation in one complex system evolving as a whole. Therefore, grounding language revitalization is an integral cultural setting and practice should be seen as a prerequisite for any successful programs, since a language cannot survive and reproduce itself without an outside culture being shaped, constituted and reconstituted, transformed and perpetuated while at the same time shaping, constituting, transforming and perpetuating sociocultural norms and behaviors. Since the reasons for language endangerment and change are mainly extra-linguistic, the social and economic dimensions of language and cultural survival must be seriously addressed, directly linking a holistic approach to cultural continuity with community and its sustainability. As both elements of the language systems and the corresponding culture system erode and disintegrate with increasing language endangerment and decreasing language vitality, it's both language and culture that should be restored on an intertwining and simultaneous basis. Therefore, effective prototypes of language and culture, learning and teaching for minority communities should be worked out and applied similarly to models implemented in teaching methods for foreign language and culture teaching. In fact, we realize that use of more than one language in daily practice can be seen as a restoration or continuity of naturally balanced multilingualism and cultural diversity that has historically been present in most regions of the world. Practices of such rebalanced multilingualism, sometimes reinforced by means of rational language planning and language policy, can be found in all parts of the world, like well-studied cases of New Guinea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Brussels, Gibraltar, Quebec, multiple regions in Africa. As clearly shown, children who come out of strong language immersion models always match or surpass their peers who participate in programs based on the usage of a dominant language, both in classroom performance and in standardized tests by researchers dealing circumstantially with minority education models, such as, for example, Tomasz Kudnapkangas, quoting, "The most important linguistic human right is education for indigenous peoples and minorities if they want to reproduce themselves. It is an unconditional right to mainly mother tongue medium education in non-fee state schools. This education, of course, including teaching a dominant language as a subject by bilingual teachers, should continue minimally 8 years, preferably longer." The results of bottom-up Navajo, Hawaiian, or Maori immersion programs included much better academic performance of their students. These programs also served as spaces of empowerment for native teachers, children, or communities. Revitalization and the use of the mother tongue through individual developments are closely related not only to psychological well-being and a higher self-esteem, but also to health indices. In addition, recent research has shown a strong correlation between language loss, deterioration in indigenous health, symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress, elevated suicide rates, and generally distorted balance in individuals' and communities' well-being. And improving health indices have also economic consequences, as shown in the published results of a recently concluded research project by Justyna Olko. Therefore, dealing with the health problems should become an essential part of integrated revitalization programs. Economic benefits, so important for local communities, can also be thought of in a more direct way, in terms of stimulating microeconomy based on creating authentic local products and stimulating the demand for them through the development of culturally oriented tourism, in which the experience of a local language would be an essential asset. A particularly promising approach is that of a social economy oriented towards solving both social and economic challenges through non-profit organizations and social enterprises. It seeks new, more efficient, bottom-up solutions to issues of specific social, economic, environmental needs, and therefore has a special potential to contribute to a more inclusive and sustainable society, with a special role for local communities and their assets. The different kinds of benefits of language revitalization and maintenance should in fact be viewed as a comprehensive joint framework combining integral cognitive development of children, empowerment of adults, construction of strong identity linked to self-esteem and psychological strength on the level of individuals and a community, sustainable development of local communities based on the preservation of traditional knowledge, especially linked to local ecology, benefits for a wider society resulting from the preservation and cultivation of multilingual spaces. Therefore, in 2016, as one of the deliverables of the project Engage Humanities in Europe, capacity building for participatory research in linguistic cultural heritage, we decided to propose possible steps and scenarios of language empowerment and revitalization that can potentially be implemented in different communities, depending on the situation and specific solution. Of course, with varying degrees of importance and in varying configurations of sequences. Those steps in empowering the minority language communities, we divided in two groups, in two sets, short-term and mid-term. Short-term steps might include establishing a transparent relationship of trust and partnership with the speech community, and assuring that native researchers and native community members participate in all stages of project design and implementation. Identifying and promoting role models for community-based programs carried out within and outside indigenous communities, with activists, teachers, indigenous and non-indigenous researchers, students, writers, artists, new speakers, non-profit associations, state institutions, and academic institutions. Conducting holistic research on language, local heritage, sociolinguistic context, in association with members of the community. Creating the necessary corpus of linguistic documentation together with members of the community. Part of the step is organizing ethno-linguistic fieldwork conducted by indigenous students and researchers, returning the products to the community, empowering native speakers as teachers, researchers, and activists, along with support for the development of indigenous research methodologies that can be employed for native researchers in academic and non-academic projects, both inside and outside the community. Creating safe monolingual spaces for native speakers inside and, if possible, also outside the community. Supporting the creation and development of local non-profit organizations run by indigenous activists. Fostering and supporting the teaching of an endangered language in community programs, taught by the native speakers of the community themselves, and embracing local passive speakers and non-speakers. Creating and publishing resources, including instructional and reference materials for the teaching of a language within and outside within and outside indigenous communities, standardizing orthography whenever necessary and useful, together with native speakers, creating and implementing curricula of indigenous native language and culture learning and teaching, restoring and promoting literacy in a language in traditional genres and in social media, fostering communication among native speakers from different communities through workshops and encounters in safe spaces, making parents, teachers, and other community members aware of the cognitive benefits of multilingualism, to stimulate positive attitudes towards learning and using a local language and towards multilingual education. The midterm steps could include establishing, implementing, and stabilizing integrated revitalization activities in language communities, maintaining permanent and stable spaces of revitalization within communities, including language nests, teaching spaces, literacy-related, artistic, cultural activities linked to the use of language, implementation of master apprentice and language at home programs in communities where intergenerational transmission has broken, where schools with immersion programs or at least strong language instructions are missing, establishing immersion-based programs in the communities, developing curricula, materials, or methodology for a complete primary and secondary school program carried out in an endangered language, supporting sustained long-term community-based programs with parallel activities carried out in external academic, cultural, and educational spaces, constructing positive language ideologies and positive language attitudes that promote language use and transmission, strengthening the historical and cultural identity of native speakers, dealing with the effects of trauma and discrimination against indigenous people and their communities, fostering and developing advanced studies and curricula in indigenous culture, history, and ethnogeography, establishing cultural institutions and language planning bodies to gradually cover all levels and all domains of corpus, status, prestige, acquisition, and technology planning, developing also supralocal, statewide language policy instruments, including cooperation with other neighboring or related indigenous communities and regional, national, and international institutions, engaging communities in the development of their own monolingual educational materials based on local ways of knowledge transmission, as well as literary texts, good literary texts, designing, implementing language learning tools and materials for the youngest generation, stimulating the creation of jobs linked to language maintenance and revitalization for professionals who are native speakers, dealing with institutions and policymakers to transform state language policy and implement deep reforms in the school system, helping local communities raise extensive funds for the revitalization program, including local, state, international sources. Concluding, the significance and impact of preserving linguistic diversity have far-reaching implications, extending into fundamental and extra-linguistic facets of modern life, both on the global and local levels, for speakers of endangered languages and for us, the broader society. To be successful, sustained, and self-replacing, the whole process needs to involve many phases, well-coordinated, multidisciplinary, mutually complementing lines of research through assessment, careful planning, and above all, collaborative, self-reflective, and conscious acting, as well as ongoing evaluation. It requires and fosters agency and self-determination, patience, long-term vision. As Lenore Grenoble briefly summarized, language revitalization is frustrating. It's slow, difficult, and yet it is of utmost importance. Thank you very much.